Be sure to check out my Amazon affiliate store, where you'll find a lot of the tools that I use in my shop. You'll also find a brief description of the tool and what I think of it. You'll find a link to my Amazon store in the description of the video. When it comes to building furniture, the mortise and tenon joint is probably the most popular joinery method in all of woodworking. The popularity of the joint is probably due primarily to its strength. It is one of the strongest woodworking joints that you can use, and examples of the joinery method have been found as far back as 7,000 years ago. Now, if you know how to dimension a piece of wood on 4 sides and you know this one simple woodworking joint, the list of woodworking projects that you can start working on are pretty much endless. Now, there are 2 different types of mortise and tenon joints. There's the integral tenon of a mortise and tenon, where the tenon is actually part of the piece of wood that's going to be joined into the mortise. And there's the floating tenon style of a mortise and tenon joint. And some people will call this either a floating tenon or a loose tenon. Now, this is the type of tenon that I prefer. So you need to make your tenon separate from your stock, and you need to make a mortise in the end grain. And then you just take your tenon and insert it into the end grain mortise. And then you have the mortise on the adjoining side of the stock, and then you can just insert the 2 with a little bit of glue. And this is an incredibly strong joint. Now, this is the style of mortise and tenon joint that I'm going to be talking about in this video. For beginners, probably the most intimidating aspect of utilizing loose tenon joinery is forming all of the end grain mortises in all of your stock for the loose tenons. Now, in the past, I've utilized 2 different methods for making these end grain mortises. And one of them involves using a version of a mortising fixture. Now, this is relatively easy to build, but if you'd like to get the plans for this one, you can download them from my website for a small fee. Now, another method that I've used to make end grain mortises in my stock is by using this horizontal mortiser. Now, this is a lot more complicated to build than the mortising fixture, but it also has a lot more bells and whistles. Now, these marks will be the start and stop points for the end grain mortise. And this mark will be the center of the mortise. And you only need to make these marks once, because once you set up the positive stops on the mortising fixture, you can just batch out all of your end grain mortises. In order to use this mortising fixture, you need to use it in conjunction with a plunge router and an attached edge guide. And the first thing I like to do is set the depth of the mortise. With the router unplugged, go ahead and plunge the spiral bit right on top of the workpiece and then lock it down. And to set the depth of the mortise, I like to use these brass setup bars and the turret that's usually on the side of a plunge router. Now the depth of the mortise is set for 1/2 inch. Now, if your edge guide has a fine adjustment like mine, you should be able to position the router bit over our center mark by just making adjustments to the fine adjustment on the edge guide. Right there, and then I can lock down my edge guide. In order to find the length of the mortise, we need to use these 2 marks that we made earlier. Now, I'm going to first position the router bit in front of this first mark, and then I'm going to set the positive stop on one side, and then I'm going to position the tip of the router bit on the other side and position the other positive stop. As I mentioned, I'm using a spiral router bit, and because the router bit is spinning in this direction, it's making the cut in this direction, I want to plunge the router and then pull it towards me as I make the cut. I don't want to plunge the router bit and then make the cut in this direction by pushing away from me. That's because the action of the router bit as it's cutting in this direction, as I'm pulling it towards me, the action of the router bit will actually pull the fence on the router into the fixture and not away from the fixture. So after a few passes, I was able to get a nice ingrained mortise, which is now ready for my loose tenon. But before I show you guys how I make my loose tenons, I'm going to show you that this fixture can also handle angled tenons. So if you had a 45-degree cut on this side of the stock, you could make an ingrained mortise on an angle, and it's really easy to do. The mortise is still going to be in the center of the stock, but I do need to reset the positive stops for the left and right travel. For the tenon material, I usually like to use the same species of wood that was used to make the mortise. And in this case, it's cherry. So I have a piece of scrap cherry that's already been flattened on one face, and I need to get it down to a 1/4 inch thick for the tenon material. And usually when I mill lumber down to a 1/4 inch thick or less, I usually like to use a piece of plywood that extends through the bottom of the planer and out onto the outfeed support. Now, in order to keep the piece of plywood from being pushed through with your stock, you'll need to secure a piece of hardwood to the end that will catch the end of the infeed support to keep it from going all the way through. In order to get the width for the tenon stock, I usually like to take a digital caliper and then just measure the length of the mortise directly from the mortise itself. And then I'll take this dimension over to the stock and cut it to width. The mortises in the ends of the stock were both made using a 1/4 inch diameter straight bit, and that ends up leaving round ends on the ends of the mortise. Now, the loose tenon stock, as is straight off of the table saw, has square ends. So ideally, you would like the ends of your loose tenon stock to match the radius on either end of the mortise. Now, in order to pull that off, I'm going to use an 1/8 inch radius roundover bit, and that'll give me a profile on each end that matches the profile on the ends of the mortises. Nice fit. Now before I cut this tenon stock to length, I need to make the mortises for the adjoining piece, and we'll do that next. Now I need to lay out the mortise for the receiving end of the joint. Now usually what I do when I'm making a mortise in a piece of stock when I'm using loose tenon joinery is I'll make a mark on center in the rail. Now, if you remember, the mortise in the end grain is also right on center. So in this example, I have a line going straight across, and this line indicates where I want the rail to start on the piece of stock. Now, in this example, I also want the rail to be inset by 3/16 of an inch, and I'm going to use a brass setup bar for that, which is 3/16 of an inch wide. And usually what I'll do is I'll set my brass setup bar up against the rail, and I'll slide everything until the brass setup bar is flush with the side of the stock. Now all I need to do is transfer that tick mark from the rail right over to the stock that's going to receive the mortise. And while keeping everything nice and square at the front, I usually like to make a line at the back of the rail as well. So this distance defines the entire width of the rail. When I laid out the length of the end grain mortises on the end of this piece of stock, if you remember, I used a 1/2 inch wide brass setup bar to do that. So I'm going to use the same 1/2 inch wide brass setup bar to make the shoulders on this piece of stock as well, or that will define the shoulders of the tenon. So this distance in between here will be the total length of the mortise that I need to make for the loose tenon. And this distance here and this distance here represent the distance for the shoulders. I captured that distance of that tick mark onto my marking gauge, and this is the mark that we set earlier when we were transferring the center of the rail onto the piece of stock. Now I'm just going to take my marking gauge and scratch a line in between these two lines. So let me go ahead and mark these out now. So that's exactly where I want my mortise to be. So this is where I'm going to center my router bit when I go to hog out this material. I bottomed out my router bit on the stock, and I'm going to set the turret to make a 3/4 of an inch deep cut. Right there. The work is clamped between two bench dogs to make it nice and secure, and now I'm ready to hog out the material. Before I cut my loose tenon stock to length, I like to get a more precise reading for both the depth of the receiving side mortise and the end grain mortise. And for that, I like to use a digital caliper. So I'll just add those two distances together, and then I like to subtract a little bit for any glue squeeze out. In order to cut the tenon material to length, I like to use a table saw sled. And I also like to use a pencil with an eraser on the end so I can hold down the tenon material that's being cut off to the right side of the blade so it doesn't go flying around. And I also like to use a positive stop, which I've set the length of the tenon material so I can quickly batch off a lot of tenon stock relatively easily. And as I mentioned earlier, I did set the length of the tenons to the total depth of both the mortises minus a little bit for glue. And in this case, I'm leaving about a 1/16 of an inch. So this tenon material is a 1/16 of an inch shorter than the total depths of both mortises. Now normally I would just coat the entire surface of this loose tenon material before I seat it into the mortise of the end grain, but for this demo I'm going to do this without any glue. Now with a little bit of clamping pressure, this would make for a really nice tight joint. And if you remember, I also made an angled loose tenon. Aside from my mortising fixture to make end grain mortises, I also like using my horizontal mortiser. Now, unlike the mortising fixture, which can only make mortises in the end grain, the horizontal mortiser can also make mortises in long grain as well. So you can do both sides of the joinery using the same tool, and that's a lot more useful than the fixture. But another disadvantage to using the mortising fixture is that because the work has to be clamped to the fixture vertically, you are limited to the length of the stock that you can fit underneath of the fixture. So that can be a big limitation depending on the size of the project that you're working on. Now, I do suppose if you wanted to, you could maybe rig up some way where you could clamp the fixture higher up on your bench and then maybe accommodate longer pieces. That's all I have. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. And also consider supporting what I do here at Garage Woodworks through Patreon. You'll find a link to my Patreon page in the description below, and you can go and check it out and see what I offer Patreon members. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.